Hello everyone, hello students, tutors and whoever is watching this video. This is Maitham Alsalman and I'd like today to share with you my experience in the region in working on countering the incitement to hatred that could potentially lead to atrocities, crimes or even human rights violations. First of all, I'm filming from the Raz, which has been under siege for more than 3 months, and the internet is cut off every night between 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. So please excuse me for not communicating enough, but I'll be more than happy to receive emails and questions from all of you. I'd like to talk today about the Middle East Coalition for Countering Hatred. The Middle East and North Africa has been strongly affected by political instability and violence since 2011. The political changes and social movements that have swept the region since the Arab Spring in 2011 have been, unfortunately, accompanied by an increase in the incidence of ethnic, religious, sectarian, and racial violence. Indeed, the growth of religious and racial hatred has reached to incredible levels in the last couple of years. And many civil society organizations perceive that this is due to the increase in incitement speeches. There is a lot of concern that the growth of terrorism, mass atrocities, violence, and hate crimes is or may be linked to incitement speech. There is clear evidence directly linking incidents of mass violence, including killings, attacks against places of worship, with incitement speech, including messages which have been spread through social media and in places of education and, unfortunately, in places of worship. And this has been done by public officials, political parties, army representatives, and religious leaders, amongst others. If we look at all the countries of the MENA region, incitement speech, alongside blasphemy and other forms of religious crimes, are the objects of a multitude of laws. These crimes are heavily sanctioned, including facing years in prison. However, the laws and policies in the Middle East are largely abused by a range of actors to suppress legitimate freedom of expression, which is protected under international human rights laws. And that's why we have clearly witnessed that blasphemy laws throughout the Middle East have violated basic human rights for all, including national, ethnic, linguistic, or religious minorities in the region. The legal and policy measures in place have also shown to be ineffective and counterproductive at addressing the increase in the number of incidents of violence in the region. And that's why it's extremely important to strike the balance between respect and protection of freedom of expression on one hand, and the prohibition of incitement speech that has the potential to lead to human rights violations. including incitement to national, racial, and religious hatred. And striking the balance between the two is a very delicate process. And it is even more delicate in situations of conflicts and post-conflicts and transitions, where some speech may be inflaming already fragile situations, leading to violence, discrimination, and targeting the minorities or vulnerable groups. Finding the balance is a process which involves a lot of actors, and not governments only, not the police only, and not justice only. It includes, in particular, civil society organizations. Non-state players are often best placed to respond effectively to incitement of hatred, to prevent violence, to build more tolerant communities across the Middle East. We feel we're closer to the community as non-state players. And this realization has led a group of us, a group of civil society organizations. In the last meeting, we had about 147 CSOs from across the Middle East. It led a group of CSOs, human rights activists, religious leaders to work towards the establishment of the first civil coalition to combat and counter national, racial, and religious hatred in the MENA region. And at the same time, work on ensuring protecting freedom of expression in line with Article 19 of the ICCPR or of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Our region has been clearly inflicted with a growth in hatred which has been not accounted for. And it's very unfortunate. It's very unfortunate to state that religious leaders have a huge responsibility in taking a stance in not only denouncing violence, but countering violence and looking for alternative messages to the messages of violence which may be legitimized by some extremists, by religious scriptures. The coalition has been formed. We worked for about 3 years in setting up the groundwork for the coalition, and we were inaugurated officially in 2015 with the attendance of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zaid bin Ra'ad al-Hussein, and the regional offices of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Tunis and Beirut supported the initiative, supported our objectives, and this has driven all of us to begin with mapping the region clearly. At first, I want to point out to a point which might be interesting to the fellow students. And this point is, we at first called it the Arab Coalition for Countering Hatred. However, we had objections from the Kurds and the Turks in Iraq, and as well from the Amazighis in Morocco, they all said, we are victims of the incitement of hatred. The incitement of hatred leads to violence against us, to discrimination against us, and to an increase in the levels of hostility. And we want to be members, but we are not Arabs. So this led to naming the coalition the Middle East Coalition for Countering Hatred that Leads to Hostility. Overall, the coalition has begun its activities, and we actually launched one activity was framing exercise to frame those who are already involved in countering extremism and hatred across the Middle East. The second activity was a workshop for civil society organizations to know how to monitor hate speech. We need to differentiate between speech which is insulting and hate speech. You could receive an insult to your ethnic group, to your religious background, to your political party, but an insult is not incitement to hatred. And this is where a big veil is placed in order to legitimize blasphemy laws. So we had a workshop to identify the tools and mechanisms to identify and implement a range of interventions to counter hate messages, or how to offer alternative speeches and promote non-discrimination, pluralism, diversity, tolerance, and respect of human rights, with the view of contributing to building more tolerant societies within the MENA region. The coalition has a central goal, and the goal is to support CSOs and faith-driven organizations in the MENA region by building their organizational and technical advocacy and research capacity in line with international human rights standards, mainly Article 19 and Article 20 of the ICCPR. It's very important as well for those who are involved in countering extremism and hatred to have an in-depth look at the UN Resolution 1618 on combating intolerance, negative stereotyping, and discrimination, incitement to violence, and violence against persons based on religion or belief. We try to spread awareness as well of the Rabat Plan of Action on the prohibition of advocacy of racial, national, or religious hatred that constitutes an incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. And we actually launched a lot of seminars across the Middle East to bring awareness about the initiative. The coalition, unfortunately, was supposed to be based in Tunis. However, we faced an unfortunate situation, and that situation was an apology from the Tunisian government to host the coalition. Due to security reasons, Tunis is passing by. So we did face turbulences. However, we've been focused on our goal. I was commissioned to be the coordinator of the coalition from the day of establishment. However, I've been on a travel ban for almost a year, so I haven't been that active in the coalition. I would like to state that unless non-state players take a major role in countering the incitement of hatred, in countering extremism, in delegitimizing terrorism and violence in the name of religion in the region, we could still witness a growth in the levels of violence, the levels of extremism, and the levels of hatred. We need to have a clear formula in our mind. Incitement of hatred leads to hostility. Hostility leads to an emotional legitimacy of the acts of discrimination or the acts of violence against others. So they're interlinked. Incitement of hatred, hostility, and violence or discrimination. So we really need to tackle the incitement of hatred. And I believe non-state players need to take a major role in addressing this issue, keeping in mind that governments in the region have not been effective in countering the growth of terrorism or the growth of extremism or the growth of the levels of the incitement of hatred. In 2011, we only had 18 suicide bombers from the region, especially from the Gulf. Today, after more than 14 years of continuous efforts by the governments, or at least published efforts, announced efforts in countering the growth of terrorism and the growth of violence in the region, today we have more than 5,387 suicide bombers who have committed suicide bombings in the last 2 or 3 years. This is a clear indicator of the necessity of involving religious leaders, non-state players, in efforts to counter the growth of extremism, terrorism, and hatred in the region. Thank you. Please send your questions and I'll be more than happy to answer. Thank you.